In 15th century Florence, one bank was more powerful than all the others. It was one of the strongest financial institutions in the world. It was even handling money for the Pope. But by the end of the century, it would be gone. Let me tell you who they were and what happened to them, because I learned about the Medici Bank. Before I start, I want to apologize for how I pronounce names. I can barely pronounce English names, and I only try Italian, setting myself up for failure here. The Medici Bank of the Renaissance is probably the most famous institution from that era. I knew about it, and that's a time period which I'm not too familiar. Historians often state that at its height, it was larger and more powerful than any of its competitors. However, the bank only lasted for less than 100 years, and its time at the top was even shorter. So, why did it rise and why did it fall? What were the major factors behind the success and failure of the Medici Bank? Also, why did it die while the family survived? Truthfully, the family didn't just survive, it actually got more powerful after the bank collapsed. It's kind of fascinating because you would think that the family's gaining power, the bank would also need to be powerful. But apparently, that just isn't true. The bank went down, but the family rose in heights. This episode isn't about the Medici after the bank, it really is about the bank itself. But I think it's still interesting to know that the family only kept growing in power and influence. Before I address the Medici Bank, I need to give you a little background on Renaissance banking. While banking during the Renaissance differed from today, there was one similarity. Banks would hold customer deposits. Banks would then take these deposits and lend them to customers. The money earned on loans was the bank's revenue. Honestly, that's pretty much how banking works today. However, due to Catholic Church doctrine, it was immoral to charge interest on loans during the Middle Ages into the Renaissance. Sure, okay. But when there's money to be made, people will get creative. And these bankers got creative. First, they operated as merchants. They would take the money held in deposits and trade it for wool and other goods, then trade those goods for money somewhere else for more than it costs to buy them, therefore making money on it. Somehow the Catholic Church was okay with this arrangement. That said, this method only made up a small percentage of the bank's revenues. Since operating as merchants was not earning enough income for the banks, they looked at other ways to earn money. They looked towards lending. But lending required getting around the church's problem with interest. That's really what the church had problems with, earning interest on your loans, the whole point of a loan. So they created three ways to get around it. They would charge penalties or damages for reasons not inherent in the loan. They would become partners with the borrower, resulting in the bank receiving a share of the profits from a business deal. And finally, and most popularly, they engage in currency exchange. Currency exchange is a concept people are familiar with even today. Different currencies trade at different values. I mean, that's why if you're an American, your dollar's worth less in some places and more in others. Same if you're in Europe. The idea meant that the Renaissance bankers could lend in one currency and receive payment in another. Historian Tim Parks provides an excellent example of how this system worked. His example has a borrower in Florence taking out a loan of 1,000 florins at a rate of 1 florin, worth 40 English pence, give or take. The banker writes this rate on a bill of exchange. The customer sends this bill of exchange to his correspondent in London. This person takes the bill of exchange to the local Medici branch and pays them 40,000 pence back. The Medici turn around and orchestrate a loan of 40,000 pence to a new customer at a rate of 1 florin worth 36 pence. This new rate means that when the new customer pays off his bill of exchange, the Medici will have netted a profit of 4 pence for every florin they loaned. It's actually a pretty clever system, a good way to get around the interest issue. You have to give bankers credit. They found the flaws in the system. It is important to note that the Medici did not develop these ideas. Historians do not consider the Medici innovators in their business practices. They kind of just followed along with what everyone else was doing. But if innovation was what caused the rise of the Medici Bank, what was it? It seems, honestly, like it was the right place at the right time. Historian Paul Strathern has Medici forming due to a vacuum in banking that began in the 1300s when three central Florentine banks collapsed, shortly before the Black Death that began in 1348. They likely collapsed due to an overextension of credit to sovereigns. The obvious issue is that banks could not enforce their debts to sovereigns. The king did not wish to repay the loan will not get repaid. Of course, I have to ask you, if you can't make a king repay a loan, how do you say no to them? How do you say you can't have a loan? I don't have an answer. I just thought it was a good question. Giovanni de' Medici established the family's head banking office in 1397, which historians view as the bank's establishment date. Giovanni took a conservative approach to running the bank. The conservative approach is an idea that would exist even after his death. Under Giovanni, the bank would avoid lending to sovereigns as best they could. He understood the flaws of lending to people who would never pay you back. They were very cautious about their lending in general. Giovanni's successor, Cosimo, who took over the bank in 1420, was worried about the cumulative effect of bad loans and informed his branch managers that they need to be cautious in their lending. Considering the bank was fairly successful under Giovanni and Cosimo, it's not a stretch to say that their conservative approach assisted in the rise of the bank. They wanted steady growth, not rapid expansion, and that's how the bank initially grew. One area in which Giovanni was willing to take risks was in his efforts to obtain papal accounts. In 1402, Giovanni lent a tremendous amount of money to Baldassare Cosa. This loan was far more than Giovanni would typically lend to customers. However, Giovanni hoped that Baldassare would advance the bank's position with the church. Baldassare was made pope in 1410, and suddenly the Medici were the papal bankers. Being a papal banker was important. The papacy was involved in various business transactions, and their bank would get large commissions from facilitating these transactions, like a real estate or stockbroker who makes a commission on each transaction. I just said transaction a lot. The income from enabling the papal businesses was so significant that over half the Medici's profits came from its two Rome branches. While the bank's relationship with the papacy would fluctuate, no other bank was as closely tied to the institution during these years. The Medici saw a second benefit from being papal bankers. Late in the bank's life, they secured the papal alum mines in Tolfa. Alum was an essential industrial item. The Medici would reap enormous profits from this business. If you're confused about the church owning mines, I will point out that it should not shock many to discover that the Catholic Church was a relatively corrupt institution during the Renaissance. The Medici did not create the papal income stream. Rather, they were just better at manipulating it to their benefit. Without question, the relationship between the papacy and the Medici was one of the major factors for the bank's success. The final reason for the success of the Medici Bank is its use of the subsidiary system. Each of their branches in different nations would operate as its own business. However, they answered to the main branch in Florence. Giovanni and Cosimo closely monitored their managers and regularly provided input to their operations. This is pretty similar to how businesses operate as subsidiaries today. The Medici would pick their branch managers from their staff. The main office would not pay the managers a salary. Instead, managers would earn a share of the profits. This system would motivate branch managers to achieve the highest profits possible. I really want to say points on the package for my Wire fans out there. Truthfully, while this arrangement is the final reason the bank was successful, in the end, it will also be responsible for the bank's failure. After establishing how the Medici Bank rose to prominence, the question remains, how did it fall? Historian Raymond de Roover had this to say regarding the downfall of the Medici Bank. As we shall see, the downfall was caused by a combination of poor management, ill-advised policies, structural weaknesses, and adverse business conditions, which were certainly worsened after 1470, owing to the shrinking volume of international trade, a contraction probably caused by the disturbances in the Levant and transfer difficulties in settling Italian claims on northern Europe. The first issue to address is the idea that general business conditions worsened, and as a result played a significant role in the Medici Bank's demise. As de Roover points out, wool prices dropped dramatically because English wool became available in smaller quantities. Not only would this decreased trade hurt the Medici Bank and merchant business, but it would also remove an item that borrowers often used to settle claims. Economic conditions would also have been depressed due to the ongoing wars in the region. To defend his claim, de Roover cites a decreasing number of banks in Florence, with the idea that it was not just a Medici problem. Essentially, de Roover is saying the Medici weren't alone in their troubles, but rather a lot of institutions were suffering. Historian Richard Goldthwait disagrees with this assessment and states that from 1460 to 1500, the number of companies reported by the banking guild annually averaged between 35 and 40 and remained consistent. Goldthwait also notes that de Roover used the decrease in guild numbers as evidence that banks were suffering. However, Goldthwait believes that these numbers reflect the guild's decreased economic function in general. So banks weren't going away, the guild was. Also, de Roover claims that banking issues extended beyond Florence. But this idea appears to be contradicted by the fact that Venice did not see significant bank failure start until 1499, so that would place the crisis in Venice 5 years after the Medici Bank closed, and many years after it lost relevance. But this is not to say that de Roover is totally off base with his claims. because de Rover points to three factors that led to the Medici Bank's downfall, and they seem accurate. He noted poor management, ill advised policies, and structural weakness. These ideas relate to two critical changes in the Medici Bank's banking practices. The first is that the Medici wanted to start working toward gaining political power and influence, and the second is that Cosimo died. Cosimo's successors could not live up to his business acumen. It was this combination that doomed the Medici Bank. Giovanni was content to gather wealth and live in the background when he ran the bank. However, historian Christopher Hibbert notes that Cosimo was more ambitious than Giovanni, with plans extending beyond the business realm. Cosimo succeeded in using his money to gain power. By the time of his death, he was considered the most powerful man in Florence. That level of power and influence does not come without cost, both monetarily and politically. Cosimo made enemies to such a degree that they managed to exile him from Florence for a short time. I must acknowledge that historians argue that Cosimo turned the exile to his benefit. But even if this is true, political enemies would be a problem plaguing the family for its existence. So, as a result, Lorenzo was excommunicated from the church, and the Medici Bank lost its extremely valuable papal account. However, while the Posse plan may have failed, it did have repercussions for the Medici. Archbishop Salviati was related. Even though the Posses may have failed, their plan did have repercussions for the Medici. Archbishop Salviati was related to the Posses through marriage and took part in the conspiracy. However, he was arrested and hanged from the windows of Palazzo del Signoria. Yikes. The Pope was not pleased with Salviati's death, so as a result, Lorenzo was excommunicated from the church and the Medici Bank lost its extremely valuable papal accounts. Florence was also declared enemy of the Papal States, Naples, and that's a bigger deal. Essentially, Florence was at war with Naples. The second cause of playing politics in the Renaissance Italy is monetary. To achieve the highest rungs in politics, a man had to spend their money, which for Cosimo and Lorenzo meant the bank's money. In reality, the two men were using the bank as their personal account, their own checking account. Aristocracy in the 1400s embraced the culture of lavish spending in order to provide proof that they were above others. The aristocrats had to spend wildly on themselves and in public projects. No family better exemplified this idea than the Medici. Cosimo's spending defined what it meant to be an aristocrat in 15th-century Florence. Cosimo took advantage of the humanism wave in Florence to enhance his authority and social ranking. Now, instead of putting profits back into the business like they used to, the Medici were pulling cash out of the bank. To be fair, not all the money was spent on lavish goods. In 1431, Florence was in debt after a series of military blunders, and Cosimo ordered the bank to issue loans to Florence to cover as many debts as he could, even though he knew that Florence would never repay the debt. This is just one example of many instances of the bank issuing loans knowing that repayment was not likely. Historian C.W. Orton explains that Cosimo gained popularity with the public because of his generous loan policy. This is a great idea if you want to be politically popular, but terrible if you're looking to run a business. The Medici Bank might have survived if Cosimo's successors were at his level, but his son and grandson Lorenzo did not share his business acumen. Piero took over after Cosimo's death in 1464, and by all accounts, did his best to run the bank. However, he made a series of blunders that only worsened the situation. First, he called in many of Cosimo's Florentine loans. This move would lead to many businesses going bankrupt and a significant economic downturn. Since the Medici were such a big player, calling in all these loans had a huge impact on the economy. It would also strengthen the cause of the Medici's enemies. During Piero's life, the Medici enemies managed to gain control of the Florentine electoral process from the Medici, which the Medici had gained during Cosimo's lifetime. Piero eventually salvaged the situation, but it cost him political favors with one of his enemies, and he had to amass an army of 8,000 men. Politics were certainly something in Renaissance Florence. Piero died young, so control of the family was left to his 20-year-old son, Lorenzo. Lorenzo had never received training in how to operate the bank. More importantly, Lorenzo had no desire to learn how to operate the bank. Lorenzo appeared to view the bank only as his personal fund for his lavish lifestyle. Problem was that Lorenzo's spending was beyond what the Medici Bank could provide. He went outside the bank for loans and used the bank's reputation as a guarantee. Lorenzo spent so lavishly that at the time of his death, he was challenging Cosimo's reputation as a builder and patron of the arts. Cosimo had long been the standard for all patrons, but at least he was doing it when the bank was making large profits, unlike Lorenzo. A good example of Lorenzo's love of spending is a collection of over 60 hardstone vases that historians believe rivaled the collection of the King of France. I try not to judge, but I think you're spending just to spend when you're trying to outdo the King of France. Lorenzo also used the bank for political gain, similar to his grandfather Cosimo. After the fall of the Posse conspiracy, which I covered earlier, Florence found itself in desperate need for arms for its soldiers. So, Lorenzo leveraged the Medici Bank's wealth and prestige to control the procurement. However, while historian Fabrizio Ansani notes that this may be a rare occasion when Lorenzo's political maneuvers made the family money, it still provides an example that even in the bank's dying days, Lorenzo was using its reputation. The Medici used the bank as a source of personal wealth, which they used for personal patronage and public loans. Lorenzo's spending alone did not cripple the bank. What hurt more was his complete disregard for running it. Lorenzo left the bank running to Francesco Sassetti and the branch managers. Sassetti was not the man for the job. He could not control his branch managers, and they began to make a series of poorer and poorer business decisions. The most significant mistakes might be failing to live up to the rules placed by Giovanni and Cosimo. Branch managers started giving out loans to sovereigns. Cue the ominous music. These were the type of loans that brought down the Medici Bank's predecessors. Giovanni and Cosimo avoided these loans because the entities were unlikely to repay the debt. Furthermore, according to Roover, the managers gave these rulers the impression that the Medici Bank was an unlimited source of funds. I don't need to explain to you that opening the vault to people who will never replenish it is a terrible idea. Soon, branches began closing, and the people knew that the bank was failing. Lorenzo initially attempted to save the bank, but eventually he gave up. He died in 1492, so he left his 20-year-old son Piero di Lorenzo in charge. Piero had even less of a clue on how to run this bank. The final death nail was the 1494 invasion of Florence by the French. They overthrew the Medici power and closed the bank. However, the bank likely would have failed without the French invasion. They had pretty much lost all their branches and were dying. I would think even with the French invasion, if the bank had a thriving subsidiary system, then it could have stayed alive and waited out the political battles occurring in Florence. But Lorenzo and his sons saw to the death of that system. The Medici would go on to be dukes and maintain power in Florence long after the death of the bank. The family would not see the end of its strength until the 18th century, which just fascinates me since their largest moneymaker was gone. But that's a different story, and this was about the bank and its rise and fall. I think what sticks out to me is, in some ways, is how ordinary it is. There's no big scandal, no scheme that brought them down, just mismanagement by people who decided they wanted to get into politics. I did want to comment on several sources I used. I will try to do this moving forward as I think it's good to give more credit to historians. Also, I like it's a very mini book review for those interested. The Medici, Power, Money, and Ambition in the Italian Renaissance by Paul Strathern. I start with this book first, because it's the book that got me hooked on the topic. Strathern states within the book that he wrote this to be a popular history. When Strathern says popular, he means for the general population. In my opinion, there are two types of history works, those meant for academics and those meant for the general population. Strathern achieves his goal because this is a book that's easy to read and covers the topic in sufficient detail. It goes beyond the bank to cover the Medici family as a whole, so if you want to learn more than just the bank, this is great. This is the type of book I would feel comfortable recommending to anyone with an interest in history. Now we have The Rise and Decline of the Medici Bank, 1397 to 1494 by Raymond de Roover. De Roover's book may be the single most comprehensive work on the Medici Bank. De Roover ignores the other aspects of the Medici and focuses solely on the bank's history. He extensively uses the bank's own records to explain the day-to-day business operations. I do want to stop and acknowledge how cool it is that so many of the bank's records survived. Don't know what incentive anyone had to keep those records, but I'm glad they did so that we now have these books. De Roover's work is vital for someone who wants more than a passing understanding of the Medici Bank. That being said, it is most certainly written for academics, and even in those circles, I think it would be considered a tough read for many. De Roover's focus on the business can sometimes make a reader feel like they're reading an accounting book. However, I'd still suggest this book for anyone wanting a deeper understanding of the Medici Bank. I feel like it's almost critical. Medici Money, Banking, Metaphysics, and Art in 15th-Century Florence by Tim Parks. Parks' work sits in the middle of Strathern and de Roover. It can feel a bit more academic at times than Strathern, but nowhere near the level of de Roover. Like Strathern, this book looks beyond the bank and gets into other areas of the family. Parks explores the relationship between the family and art. This relationship would help the Medici cultivate a reputation they would use to their advantage later. I consider this to be a good read. Moving on to The House of Medici, Its Rise and Fall by Christopher Hibbert. This book focuses way less on the bank and more on the family. This work would be something I'd recommend to anyone looking to put their focus away from the economic histories involving the bank. The history of the Medici family is fascinating, seeing their influence and relationship with the papacy. So, hey, if you're looking to learn about the family, I really encourage you to read this book. Finally, The Family Medici, The Hidden History of the Medici Dynasty by Mary Hollingsworth. Hollingsworth is operating in the same arena as Hibbert with her book. She focuses less on the bank and more on the family's political operations. Her goal is to remove the romantic portrait of the Medici family and describe their history in a much darker tone. Hollingsworth brings the Medici to the level of devious, deceitful people looking to gain and hold power. Definitely makes for an interesting read. I think any one of these books would be fun for anyone looking to learn about the Medici. Obviously, if you're looking to go about the bank, I would start with Strathern for all these, and then Roover if you're really looking to get into the bank. The rest focus far more away. That's it. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please like, subscribe, do all those fun things, and I will see you next time.